From the outside perspective, it may seem like avoidants don't care at all or have any feelings whatsoever during no contact, but this couldn't be further from the truth. On the contrary, avoidants actually do feel a lot during this time, especially if they're the ones who initiate no contact with their ex. So today I'm going to be discussing what an avoidant feels during no contact. For those who are new to my channel, my name is Charlie, and I am healing my fearful avoidant attachment style. Considering I have both anxious and avoidant traits, I'm in a really unique position to share what each side feels and shed some light on their perspective. I also help others navigate the challenges of no contact, so if you're interested in a one-on-one session with me, then feel free to go to healingwithcharlie.co and book a session. So very quickly, what is no contact? Essentially, no contact means just that. No contact whatsoever. This means no calls, no emails, no catching up, no texting, no lurking their social media or liking their posts or viewing their stories, absolutely nothing. No indirect or direct communication or contact whatsoever. No contact can be a really valuable tool for people trying to move on from a relationship because it gives each party the space to heal and detach from otherwise difficult breakups. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's actually dive into what an avoidant will feel during no contact with you. Generally speaking, the first phase an avoidant feels is relief. This is where the hard part is over and they've ripped off that band-aid and they're ready to just move on with their life. The thing that's really unique about avoidance is chances are they moved on during the relationship before the breakup happened. Given they are conflict avoidant, they may not have shared this information with you leading up to the actual breakup itself, which is why many anxious attachers feel like the breakup kind of hits them by surprise. They feel like it happens out of the blue, but really signs were there leading up to that point. And so because avoidants have taken the time to already detach from the relationship before the breakup happens, many anxious attachers on the receiving end feel as though avoidants don't care that the breakup is happening at all. But you have to consider that if you've already taken the time to mourn the relationship while you were still together, when it actually comes time to do the hard part of the actual breakup, you're probably not going to be as impacted because you just want to get it over with. And this can actually be very difficult for anxious attachers to rationalize because essentially they were left in the dark while this other person was moving on for them. During that whole time, the anxious attacher was still trying to love them, still trying to create connection and trying to essentially save the relationship without realizing it. Just because an avoidant is in the relief phase doesn't necessarily mean that they feel relief in general. They feel relief because they're no longer smothered by that connection and they've gotten the hard part, which they've built up in their mind as this big dramatic event up until it actually happens. So that's why they feel relief. It's like ripping off a band-aid, as I said. Now that they've gotten it off, they can start to focus on healing and letting that scar fade over time. And just because they feel relief doesn't mean they don't feel sadness or pain during the breakup itself. Eventually it does hit them, but during this phase, they don't feel that pain immediately. What's really happening to their subconscious programming is that it's telling them to feel relief so that they feel confident about their decision. But what's actually taking place is their relief is trying to battle with the feelings of sadness, and their avoidance is really struggling to prevent them from feeling that in the first place. So it really pushes those feelings of relief so that they can focus on just a better tomorrow. Now, this phase can last anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, but try not to get married to timelines. This isn't an exact science, and some avoidants will go through this much faster, whereas some avoidants will feel relief much longer. Generally speaking, they actually spend most of this time rationalizing why the relationship wouldn't have worked out to reinforce the decision that they've made. And that is actually what prevents them from fully rationalizing and understanding the breakup and the relationship on an emotional level. It's sort of like psychological gymnastics that's taking place, and they may not actually be aware of that. And so it's really easy to get upset with avoidance during this time because they can come off as very cold and emotionless. They're very detached from the outcome because they've already taken the time to move on, as I've said. But as an anxious attacher, try not to focus on how they're showing up in that moment and how they're not showing up and how they are actively suppressing those emotions, because eventually it will will hit them like a bus. There is a stark difference between understanding and rationalizing a breakup in relationship and understanding it on an emotional and empathetic level. Their system really sees the latter as very scary. It doesn't want to really dive into those deep layers of emotions because it was taught that having feelings and emotions is bad. There's a lot of shame tied to those emotions, and therefore their system activates to really suppress those feelings from coming up to the surface. And that's why they essentially feel relief. During this time, they actually may reach out to you a couple times after the breakup has happened just to check in on you and to see how you are, because they are fluctuating between feeling rational and emotional. So if they reach out to you, try not to think about it too much. Don't place any meaning onto their attempts to connect with you. It's really just them trying to see how you are, but if anything you take away from it, take it as a sign of their human nature. They actually do care about you. Otherwise, they wouldn't reach out at all. So don't think that they're cold and lifeless just because they're reaching out to you after the breakup. They aren't just thinking about themselves, and that is a clear indication of that. You will find, though, that after they've reached out a few times, they will probably go radio silent or completely embrace no contact. If you're an anxious attacher, this will be devastating. You won't hear from them at all. So generally speaking, this is the worst time to try and reach out to an avoidant and make amends or try to make it work, because they just aren't going to be receptive to it. They are going through what's called deactivation, where they can only see the negatives of that connection you've both shared, and they're left to only see how it's impacted you and how much stress that's placing on them. Again, they have a negative association with emotions, and they're seeing how that negative association is playing out with their anxious ex. So if you come on very strong, very needy, very emotional, which realistically anybody would, they're probably not going to be receptive to it. And that's why they come off as very cold anytime an anxious ex tries to reach out to an avoidant during the relief phase. It's also during this time where you may start to see them having the time of their life. And I understand how confusing that can be from the receiving end. I've been there myself, but you have to understand their brain is trying to motivate them to do anything to release happy chemicals, to make them feel confident in their decision. And when they've built up this whole idea that they would be better off alone, they really need to create the positive outcomes that they've thought so much about. So you're going to start to see them reconnecting with old friends, maybe going out, engaging in new hobbies and interests, and possibly even partying a lot if that's what they prefer to do. Now, not every avoidant is a party animal, and they don't just suppress their emotions with alcohol or drugs. Although some actually do that, it's important to consider that they're just really focusing on themselves at this time, and you just need to let them be. Don't try to reinitiate contact or communication, because you'll only end up hurting yourself at the end of the day. Of course, much of this is short-lived until the feelings of the relationship begin to resurface, and that's exactly what phase 2 is. It's where they start to actually unpack what's happened within that relationship and that breakup itself. So remember how I said their subconscious programming actively works to distract them from their emotions because of the negative associations with them? Well, that's exactly what happens in this phase, except it kicks into overdrive. Many unhealed avoidants operate through the lens of their feelings versus their fears. When their feelings are very high, they tend to feel very scared, and that triggers their fears to increase. And when those fears increase more than those feelings, they start to deactivate. And when they deactivate, they choose to seek out what's called creature comforts. Now, I love the topic of creature comforts because they can be very polarizing within the attachment theory community. Basically, what creature comforts are just things that an avoidant will turn to or rely on to emotionally process their feelings in a safe environment. So unlike how anxious attachers want to tackle issues head on, avoidants would prefer to space out and distance those emotions over time and process them in shorter bursts. And avoidants will find that these creature comforts will start to take prevalence in their life because the feelings of what it means to now be single is actually starting to hit home. They just may not actually actually realize that. Such creature comforts can include things like doubling down on work, maybe taking extra shifts, or picking up old hobbies that really occupy their time and their mind. It all serves as a distraction, and so sometimes those creature comforts can be friends. And that's why some avoidants tend to party a lot, because when you're going out and you're having a fun time, you're not thinking about the bad times. After a while, it does catch up with them and they can't really fight it anymore. At some point, they do have to face the music and come to terms with the breakup, the relationship, and all of the thoughts and associations they have with all of it. Now, this may be surprising to some anxious attachers, but many avoidants that I've spoken to actually turned to journaling as a creature comfort. Yes, journaling. Many avoidants are emotionally self-aware, they just don't share it out in the open like anxious attachers do. Sometimes they only feel safe doing so in a closed space such as a book or a journal where they can write down their thoughts and reflect just between them and the paper. Speaking of journaling, if you're having a very difficult time with starting no contact, then feel free to download my free 14-day journal. It can help everybody get started with no contact during the first 2 weeks, because those are statistically the hardest days of no contact. To download this, just go to healingwithcharlie.co/links and choose the 14-day no contact journal option. It's absolutely free to download, and you can download it right on the spot and get started. Creature comforts will vary from person to person, but just because they serve as a distraction doesn't mean the avoidant isn't actually processing what's going on as they take place. On the contrary, they're actually great ways for avoidants to start scraping away the layers of those emotions to understand them in a safe space and dynamic that feels natural for them. While anxious attachers can feel all of their feelings at once and it can be very overwhelming, avoidants actually prefer to take things at a slower pace. And so they'll rely on these creature comforts to start thinking about things. Like, for example, anytime I've been doing things like puzzles or gaming or any other type of creature comfort, there are times where in the back of my mind, I'm actually processing and working through problems in my life. So just because on the outside it looks like they're serving as a distraction, it doesn't necessarily mean that that distraction is bad. There is such a thing as a positive, healthy distraction that can help people to actually cope. Take, for example, art therapy. Art therapy is a great way to come to terms with traumatic things that happen in your life. Now, many people think that just because you're doing art, you must only be focused on that artwork, but it can actually be a channel to help you really dial in those emotions and understand them on new ways that you probably couldn't have understood otherwise. So just because avoidants turn to creature comforts doesn't mean we should shame them for that. On the contrary, we should encourage that because it'll help them to come to terms with their emotions, and it'll actually bring down those fears versus their feelings to a level where they actually feel safe to actually unpack all of those feelings and emotions. Now, depending on how severe someone's avoidant attachment style is and their strategies to get their needs met, it may actually take them a bit longer to fully process everything. The more engaging a creature comfort is, the more time it will take for them to actually get to the root of those issues. There are certain creature comforts that can prevent emotional processing altogether. For example, if your ex is someone who was very work motivated, they're a high performer, then chances are work is going to occupy their thoughts and their time, and they may not actually get to the bottom of their issues. But if there are other things such as like hobbies, maybe like Pokemon cards or Warhammer 40K or anything that causes them to sit down in a quiet space and just really reflect and get in the zone, they can actually enter a flow state and begin unpacking all of that in a way that feels good for them. So because of all of this, it may take them a little bit more time compared to anxious attachers to come to terms with their emotions and the breakup. But generally speaking, for this second phase, it can take avoidants anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks. And as I said, don't get married to these. That's not an exact science and it varies from person to person. But generally speaking, in my experience working with avoidants, this is the trend that I've seen. I've seen many of them take this amount of time to actually come to terms with their breakup until they enter phase 3. Phase 3 is not one that some anxious attacher exes may appreciate hearing, but this is one where the avoidant actually tries to move on. And this can go one of two ways. They can actually come to terms with their emotions on an emotional level rather than a rational one, and they can understand the breakup and all that it served in their life, and that can generally set them up to possibly find a really good relationship, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their avoidant traits have been healed. The other way is if they've really doubled down on those creature comforts which have prevented them from acknowledging those feelings and avoidant traits altogether, then more than likely they're going to repeat the same cycle, and they may even move on to find someone else that is possibly similar to their ex. This is usually an attempt to try and heal from the last relationship subconsciously, and it's why many anxious attachers will feel like their avoidant ex moved on to just date someone that is really similar to them. It's eerily creepy how many times I've heard that come up in my one-on-one sessions with anxious attachers, but it is a trend that I like to share because it shouldn't come as a surprise if it happens to you. So essentially, they've detached from the breakup and all of the emotions associated with that, but just because they've detached doesn't mean those feelings aren't still there. It doesn't mean the avoidant doesn't still have feelings for their ex. Detachment is really just the process of being able to understand the relationship on all terms, whether it's rationally and emotionally. You've essentially taken your ex off of a pedestal, and you see in the ways in which they're good, the ways in which they're bad, but also the ways in which the avoidant has shown up in that relationship, and hopefully where they can improve in their next relationship. So as I mentioned, this is actually a phase where avoidants will actually start dating again, or they will actually double down on any hobbies and interests. Just because an avoidant moves on doesn't mean it's moving on with someone else. Sometimes they move on to themselves and they really double down on those hobbies and interests. I like to think of it as anytime you've seen someone that has flourished and shined and glowed up after a relationship and maybe started a new successful business, that could possibly be a sign of an avoidant attachment. And speaking on my own personal experience as a fearful avoidant that has avoidant traits, during my breakup when I experienced it, I actually doubled down on posting on TikTok. Again, one of my wounds during that last relationship was I felt like I wasn't allowed to really put myself out there on social media because of jealousy and other issues within the relationship. And once I was out of it, I felt comfortable embracing that. But also, in a way, it was preventing me from fully diving deep into those emotions. But with that said, I quickly grew my TikTok account over 90,000 followers in a little under 2 years. And I'm very proud of all of that and everything that's come with it, because I've done it in a way that's actually allowed me to heal now and detach from that breakup so that I can start building better relationships moving forward. Now, that's just my personal example, but in my one-on-one sessions, I've had other people who have gone through the same thing. Many avoidants have started their own businesses. They've made new friends. They've overcome other insecurities that were really big issues in their lives during those relationships. So just because someone moves on doesn't mean it's necessarily with someone else. Sometimes they move on to find themselves. If you have an avoidant that doesn't necessarily work on their issues and they move on pretty soon to someone else, chances are they haven't really acknowledged their avoidant traits and they'll be doomed to repeat the same mistakes from the last relationship. Ultimately, as I said, if they date someone who is very similar to their ex, then they may just be doing this as a way to heal from that last breakup because they think in their mind they've fully moved on. They don't really think about that person anymore, but really their avoidance side has just won the battle. It's taken over and it's fully suppressed those feelings to the point where they don't even feel them anymore. And that just means they're basically doomed to repeat history if these issues from the last relationship go unaddressed. And it's a shame because the new person they might become involved with doesn't know any better. They don't know otherwise, and unfortunately, the anxious avoidance cycle is probably going to repeat. And this phase can last 4 to 8 weeks. It really all depends if they choose to start dating and they find someone else, or if they choose to really find themselves, then it can last 4 to 8 weeks until they reach phase 4, which is the nostalgia phase. The nostalgia or curiosity phase, as some call it, is one that usually takes some time to actually come about. There's a lot that has to take place in order for it to happen for an avoidant, but rest assured, Most avoidants that I've worked with have all felt this at one point or another. Now, if you've been very good with no contact and you've been sticking with it, you haven't been contacting your avoidant ex, then chances are your avoidant is going to become curious about you much sooner rather than later. And don't get me wrong, just because they've moved on to someone else, they have a whole new partner and they're dating again, doesn't mean this can't happen. It is very possible to feel nostalgia for an ex while you are already in a new relationship. Again, going back to that same point I made about using that new person as a way to come to terms with that last relationship, you will actually start to feel this while you're in the new relationship. And it can actually make the start of that new relationship really rocky. This is where they begin to feel nostalgic about the relationship that they've had, maybe because the honeymoon phase of this new relationship has worn off, or if they've just been in no contact, they may just genuinely be curious about what you've been up to because hopefully they haven't heard from you in such a long time. And again, going back to that concept of feelings versus fears, a lot of the fears and negative associations that they had with that relationship have come down. And so naturally they feel more comfortable circling back to you. So because some time has passed, it's allowed for an air of mystery. And I genuinely think that mystery is one of the core elements to getting an ex back during no contact. When you are distancing yourself and you create scarcity, the avoidant is left to feel curious about what you've been up to, and that whole mystery can actually snowball into a rekindled relationship if that's what you both choose. And during this phase, it's when they're most likely to reach out to you. Now, keep in mind, unlike anxious attachers, avoidants will not just immediately come out and say that they miss you and that they love you. Some may, but the majority will actually try and ease their way in slowly over time. You'll find them maybe lurking your social media. They may even unblock you if they had you blocked before. They may DM you and just say, hey, how have you been? Do you want to catch up? It's very different from the anxious attachers approach when they're trying to reconnect with an ex, because anxious attachers will sometimes leave this big, grand example of their love for an ex because they think that that's what makes people love them, is when they share all of this big emotion over a long text message or a really well thought out voice message. But for avoidance, they may not actually do that. They may just test the waters at first to see if it's even safe to engage with you, to see if you're even available to meet and catch up and talk about old times. Again, they're feeling a sense of nostalgia. They want to maybe feel that again and go back to where you were in the beginning, the honeymoon phase. But keep in mind, just because time has passed and they are reaching out to you doesn't necessarily mean they've healed. It doesn't mean they've come to terms with their avoidant attachment and all the ways that manifests as unhealthy behaviors within the relationship. So just because they're reaching out doesn't mean you need to engage. If you want to see what they've been up to and just catch up, you most certainly can do that. Just because somebody asks to meet up doesn't mean it has to snowball into another big romantic relationship. But if you are thinking about getting back together with an avoidant ex and you would like some advice on how to do that, feel free to reach out to me and book a session. As somebody who has reconnected with their avoidant ex, I have a lot of information on how to do that. So those are the 4 phases an avoidant will feel during no contact. If you're an anxious attacher going through no contact with an avoidant, then I really do feel for you. I've been there myself, and I've overcome a lot of the challenges that are part of that. Now, with that said, this is possibly the best time to start working on yourself. It is a chance for you to redefine what it means to be you and to rediscover yourself again in the relationship, because many anxious attachers during anxious avoidant relationships tend to lose themselves. They tend to lose the concept of their own identity, and that's what makes breakups for them so difficult. If you're interested in learning about what an anxious attacher feels during no contact, then feel free to check out that video. I have a lot of great information because personally, that was my experience with no contact. It was an emotional roller coaster, and I can share a lot of great advice with you on how to navigate that. So best of luck with your no contact journey. I wish you all the best with healing, and I will see you in the next video.